The face. During the winter of my first year at university, after nearly a year of exploring various haunted spots with my mentor, a university senior and an expert in the occult, the cold weather made me less eager to go out. One day during the New Year holiday, my mentor unexpectedly came to visit my apartment. With nothing much to do, I huddled under the kotatsu playing Game Boy, while my mentor absent-mindedly watched TV. Suddenly he said, "Huh?" And I turned to see what had caught his attention. The TV was showing a diver exploring the seabed somewhere. That statue, oh, it's gone now. The screen quickly changed, but for a brief moment, I had caught a glimpse of it. The announcer mentioned that ancient ruins from the Hellenistic period had been discovered off the coast of Egypt in the Mediterranean. The underwater camera showed ancient stone structures submerged beneath the sea, and among them, there was a statue pinned under a collapsed column. It must have been a statue of some god, and its face bore an expression of what looked like agony, as if it were suffering at the bottom of the muddy sea. The eerie intensity of its expression made it hard to believe it was originally carved that way. The program continued to the next news story, without further incident. "Does something like that really happen?" I asked. My mentor, looking thoughtful, began to explain. "Have you heard of the Haibutsu Kishaku movement?" My mentor's major was Buddhist art, and he knew of a similar example from Japan. During the transition from the Edo period to the Meiji era, when Japan shifted from the syncretism of Shinto and Buddhism to a time when Buddhism faced severe suppression by Shintoism, many temples were destroyed, and Buddhist artifacts and statues were burned. Even shrines with strong Buddhist influences saw their statues removed and often destroyed. The persecution of esoteric Buddhism was particularly intense. For instance, the temple of Kinpusenji in Yoshino was destroyed, and surrounding temples were attacked one after another. In one such temple, something strange happened. The monks were attacked by Shinto purists, and the esoteric Buddhist statues, including those of Fudo Myu, were buried in the temple garden before the temple was abandoned. After the persecution had subsided, a treasure hunter from the nearby area, having heard of the buried statues, decided to dig them up. But when he unearthed the statues, he found that every single one had a face twisted in fury. Even statues that were originally gentle and peaceful in expression had faces more terrifying than the demons of hell. Afraid of their wrath, the man set the statues on fire. The wooden statues burned for 6 days straight, and throughout, a sound like groaning could be heard. The story was so intense that I found myself sitting upright in attention. A few years ago, I read an interview with a living national treasure, a master sculptor of Buddhist statues, in a foreign media outlet. The journalist asked how he was able to create such profound, archaic smiles, and the sculptor answered, "I don't carve it. The statue smiles on its own." I was amazed when I heard that. It was rare to hear my mentor praise someone else. I began to wonder if statues, though lifeless, might indeed be able to express emotions. Speaking of which, I once tried something interesting using a bit of hypnotism I've dabbled in. I started to feel a bit uneasy about what he was going to say. I whispered to an ordinary bust, "You're a person turned to stone." Creepy. What kind of thoughts does this guy have? I didn't dare ask what happened next. The photograph. In the spring of my second year at university, I casually dropped by my mentor's place. My mentor, an upperclassman and a master in the occult, was sitting in the middle of his small room staring intently at some photographs. "What are those photos?" "Spirit photographs," he replied. I was a bit taken aback. It wasn't that I found spirit photographs particularly frightening, but the sheer number of them was unsettling. The tatami floor was littered with albums, and there must have been hundreds of photos. When I asked where he got so many, he simply said, "From a dealer," without looking up from the photos. Apparently, there's a shop in Osaka that deals in such things. People bring spirit photos to temples or shrines, asking for them to be exorcised, and they often ask for the photos to be disposed of as well. Instead of being burned, these photos are sometimes sold on the black market to collectors. I could hardly believe it. I picked up a few photos, and they were all intense. There were no simple, misty images. Each one was disturbing. A photo of a child playing in a park with no head. A picture of a man standing in shallow water at a beach, his expression emotionless, even though the depth of the water seemed too shallow. A family photo with a random altar-like structure, appearing without context. I nervously asked my mentor, "These have all been exorcised, right? Do you think priests and monks who properly perform exorcisms would allow something like this to be sold in the shadows?" "So, they haven't been exorcised," I said, trying to leave. But my mentor grabbed my arm. "No!" I felt like just being in that room might curse me. I imagined this must be how it feels to run into 10 detectives at a mountain lodge during a snowstorm. Resigned, I sat down in the corner of the room. My mentor continued to scrutinize the photos, his brow furrowed. Suddenly, I noticed an odd photo among the stack in front of me and picked it up. Odd because it wasn't odd at all. Just a regular landscape photo. "What about this one?" I showed him. "Oh, this one had a woman's face at the base of the tree. Wait, it's gone. It disappeared." He said it so casually, but it terrified me. I almost wet myself right there. After sitting silently for a while, my mentor spoke up. "In the past, people used to say that if you were photographed in the center of a picture, your soul would be taken or your life would be shortened. Do you know why? I guess because older people like teachers or bosses usually stood in the center. So when people looked back at old photos and realized those people had passed away, rumors naturally started." "Then, what do you make of this photo?" my mentor asked, pulling out an old black and white picture. It showed 3 men in kimonos standing in a garden. A misty figure hovered above the head of the middle-aged man in the center, resembling a face. "If you saw this, you'd think your soul was being taken, right?" I agreed. "It would have been terrifying to see this if you were the person in the photo." My mentor casually made a bad pun, and then he returned the photo to the stack. "It's strange that people talk about souls being taken, yet they only say that your life is shortened, not that you die instantly." I had never thought of it that way. Maybe people in the past believed that the soul had a quantity, and losing part of it would shorten your life. That could be the case, I agreed. But what if a spirit's soul is actually captured in a photograph? What happens then? Isn't that what spirit photography is all about? It must be painful, like having a piece of yourself torn away. I made a joking reply, but then I started to think seriously about it. But that's based on the assumptions of people from the past. You can't generalize that idea now. I felt pleased with myself for making a clever point. What if it's the spirit of someone from the past who believed in those ideas? My mentor asked casually. What would happen? Maybe they'd come to take it back, he whispered. I wished he wouldn't say things like that. Despite his teasing, my mentor continued to examine the photos with a serious expression. I noticed that he had been looking at the same photo over and over since I entered the room. Knowing it might be a sensitive issue, I asked, "What's the matter?" Without a word, he handed me 2 photos. Nervously, I took them from him. Whoa! I instinctively recoiled and turned my eyes away. I didn't get a good look, but I could tell something was seriously wrong. These photos were taken in different locations, but they show the same thing. Let me see. Right, this one on the right was taken during a family trip to the mouse-themed park in Urayasu, Chiba. The other one was taken on a street corner in Fukuyama, Hiroshima, my mentor explained, flipping through a list of information. He added that photos with more information attached fetch a higher price. Of course, they were taken by different people, 4 years and 6 years ago. They just happened to end up with the same dealer, but I don't think there's any connection beyond that. Curiosity got the better of me, and I was about to open my eyes to look. At that moment, my mentor said, "Wait," stopping me and walking over to the window. "It's night now," he added with a troubled look. I froze, feeling anxious as I put the photos down. My mentor pulled the curtains aside, revealing that the sun had completely set. I remembered arriving around 5 p.m., so it wasn't surprising that it had started to get dark. But when I checked my watch, the hour hand was pointing at 9. "What? It's that late already?" I exclaimed in shock. My mentor bit his lip, muttering, "This is bad. Really bad." He then asked me, "What time did you think it was?" "Around 6:30, I guess." Although it did feel like time had passed quickly, I thought it was just because we had been so focused on the photos. I thought it was noon. That's impossible. But my mentor wasn't joking. Could our internal clocks have been thrown off somehow? My mentor shrugged and said, "Let's call it a day." I didn't quite understand what was happening, but I just wanted to go home. As I began to help clean up the photos scattered around the room, I hesitated in front of the 2 photos I had just put down. My mentor's words about the same thing appearing in different photos bothered me, but my gut told me not to look. At that moment, my mentor glanced around the floor with an oddly satisfied expression. It makes you realize that humans have an unconscious self-defense mechanism. What was he talking about now? "What do you do at the zoo?" His question seemed to come out of nowhere. You go to see the animals, I guess." "That's right. We pay to go to the zoo and stand in front of each cage, observing the animals inside." "But what about the animals?" "From their perspective, they're just sitting there, while all these colorful monkeys come by to show themselves off." Was he comparing animals to the spirits in the photos? I started to understand what he was getting at. Staring at the floor, my mentor murmured as if talking to himself, "He who gazes into the abyss must also fear the abyss gazing back." "Isn't that Nietzsche?" I asked. "No, that's me," he replied, pointing to the photos scattered across the floor. "Why did you turn those over?" My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the 2 photos. I noticed several others had been turned face down among the piles. I hadn't been conscious of it at all. I was sure all the photos had been face up. Had I turned them over myself? A shiver ran down my spine, and my whole body trembled. He who fights with monsters should be careful not to become a monster. So it is Nietzsche after all, I thought. But I didn't have the energy to say it aloud. I wasn't about to become a monster, but I definitely didn't have the courage to turn those photos back over. The funeral rites. During the summer vacation of my second year at university, I accompanied an acquaintance to his hometown in the countryside. He insisted I come along, so I agreed, but the journey took a grueling 8 hours by train and bus, leaving me thoroughly exhausted. This acquaintance was a senior at university, someone I looked up to or mocked, depending on the moment, because of his deep interest in the occult. When he told me to come with a mischievous grin, I couldn't refuse. In truth, I was just as curious about the unknown as he was. The small village was nestled deep in the mountains near the prefectural border, at a high altitude where it was chilly even in the summer. When we arrived at the single-story house surrounded by hedges, an older woman, whom my senior introduced as a relative, came out to greet us. My senior smiled, but the people in the house seemed oddly uncomfortable, making me feel out of place. After we put down our bags in the room we were given, I casually asked my senior about the strange atmosphere. He initially brushed it off, saying they were distant relatives. But after some pressing, he admitted the truth. They were really distant relatives, so distant that it made me feel even more uneasy. Normally, people in the countryside are happy to host even distant relatives, especially children visiting during the summer vacation. But in this case, the child was already a university student, and it must have felt strange to the relatives that an adult they barely knew had shown up with a friend asking to stay. Of course, the distant family connection was just an excuse for us to stay. The real reason was that my senior wanted to investigate something mysterious. Feeling very out of place, I spent my days at the house trying to keep myself occupied by visiting the nearby stream or taking long walks along the mountain paths. My senior, on the other hand, spent his time either staring at a university notebook he had brought with him or wandering off to visit elderly neighbors, engaging them in long conversations. I knew how my senior operated, so I didn't say anything and just waited. On the 6th night, after I had gone 6 days without speaking a single word to the 2 children living in the house, my senior finally broke his silence. All right, I get it. I'll tell you," he said in a hushed voice as he sat cross-legged on his futon and closed the sliding doors to the 6 tatami mat room. "Do you know the Burial and Cremation Act?" He explained that the law was created to transition traditional burial practices like inhumation, sky burial, and wind burial to government-controlled cremation. It was an effort to take the customs surrounding death away from local practices, he said. He then asked if I had noticed that the graves in the area were relatively new. I admitted I hadn't paid much attention, although I had seen the graveyard. This area used to have a very unique funeral practice, he explained. He had obviously known this before coming, and he was here to verify something. My heart began to race. I had a feeling that once I heard this, there would be no turning back. The house was silent. In the dim light of the nightlight, my senior continued. When someone died, their body was cremated, and the ashes were scattered over the fields. This was a way to neutralize the acidity of the soil. But the strange thing isn't the practice itself. Up until the mid-Edo period, burying the dead wasn't a common practice. Corpses were something to be discarded. The chill in the room intensified, despite it being summer. But there was a deeper reason why this village could so easily scatter the ashes of the dead in their fields. They didn't see the body as the person's true self, as the vessel of their soul. They believed they were properly mourning the deceased by extracting the essence from the body. It took me a moment to grasp the meaning of extracting the essence. In this village, there wasn't a funeral association or anything like that. The funerals were conducted by a family of shamans passed down through generations. They were called the Kai. When someone died, the shamans took the body, extracted the essence, and returned the body to the family, who then burned it and scattered the ashes in their fields. The extracted essence was placed in a wooden box, which was then buried beneath a stone that the Ki managed. This stone was essentially their gravestone, and all prayers and rituals were directed toward this stone. They referred to this essence as onmi. It was hard to get the elderly villagers to talk about it. I now understood why my senior had come to this remote mountain village. He wanted to see the contents of those wooden boxes. That was the kind of person he was. This practice wasn't observed in the neighboring village down the mountain. There was a Jodo-shu temple there, and the villagers were members of its congregation. I don't know what their practices were before the temple was built, but it seems that this village's unique rituals continued quietly and exclusively within this community. The practice ended during the Meiji period, before the Burial and Cremation Act was enacted. So, all the graves in this village date from the Meiji era or later, with most being from the Taisho or Showa periods. We went to sleep after that. That night, I dreamed I was being buried alive in a wooden coffin. The next morning, while having breakfast with the family, they subtly suggested it might be time for us to leave, but I wasn't going to leave until I saw the contents of those boxes, even though the food tasted bland in my mouth. I didn't go into the mountains that day, feeling a strange unease. Instead, I spent the day by a nearby river, lost in thought. I'm less interested in what's in those wooden boxes than in understanding what the people of this village consider to be the true essence of a person, my senior had said. I didn't want to know, but I could guess. It was just a matter of figuring out which organ it was. As I sat by the river splashing water with my hand, I noticed the village children watching me from a distance. They probably had no idea about the village's past customs. That night, at the witching hour, my senior whispered, "Let's go." We crossed the river and made our way through the darkness. Our destination was the temple. It's that Jodo-shu temple. I don't know what kind of pressure they applied, but during the Meiji period, they managed to suppress the local beliefs and bring the villagers into their fold. Now, everyone in that area follows Buddhist rites. We quietly slipped through the temple gate. I wanted to go back. Afterward, the family of shamans, who managed the funeral rituals, known as the Kai, died out, supposedly. But I suspect there was persecution involved. As for the wooden boxes, it seems they weren't destroyed, although the contents were from a different religion. The Jodo-shu monks weren't so heartless as to simply discard them. Instead, the then head priest took them and stored them in the temple's underground vault. They've been there ever since. Forgotten. I was impressed by how thoroughly he had investigated the matter. We crept forward, guided by a small penlight, making sure there were no lights on in the temple grounds. My heart was pounding as I glanced at the shadowy outline of the small main hall. There was no way we were here to see those wooden boxes by any legitimate means. My major is Buddhist art, so I used that as a pretext to get to know the head priest here and borrow the key, he explained. There's no way that's true. If it were, we wouldn't have to sneak in like thieves in the middle of the night. Here it is, my senior said. Near the main hall, there was a small shed-like structure, with a door secured by an iron lock. It's a vault, he explained. Apparently, the contents of the wooden boxes had been a mystery to the local people, forbidden knowledge. That, according to my senior, was strange. If these boxes held something integral to a person's identity, why was the nature of that essence kept secret, even though people were expected to revere and fear it? It doesn't make sense. The only ones who knew were the shamans who extracted the essence and possibly the head priest who later retrieved the boxes and placed them in this vault. My senior quietly fiddled with the lock, carefully opening the door without making a sound. A musty odor wafted up from the stairs, leading underground, and we descended into the darkness. As we descended, I felt as though the staircase would never end. In reality, it was just one flight down, but it felt like a long, unending descent. This vault had originally been used to store the temple's precious scriptures, but now it had a new occupant, my senior explained. It's a place of containment for something impure. His whispered words made me feel faint. With the combination of the high-altitude location, the cold of the underground vault, and the dead of night, it felt like winter. I hugged my thinly clad shoulders as I nervously followed my senior. The penlight wasn't bright enough to reveal much, but the vault seemed deeper than I had expected. Shelves lined both walls, filled with books and Buddhist artifacts. It was at the very back. A faint, eerie sound came from somewhere. Was it my senior's voice? Or was I just imagining things? A small mound covered in thick cloth and a blue sheet was against the back wall. I wanted to leave and reached out to grab my senior's sleeve, but somehow my hand missed, remaining still at my side. My senior slowly approached the mound and peeled back the cloth and sheet, revealing a large wooden box. It was much bigger than I had expected. I had imagined the box would be small, containing something like a desiccated organ. But there were fewer boxes here than I had thought, probably fewer than 30, and each was large enough to require 2 hands to carry. A sense of dread washed over me. The boxes were clearly deteriorating. Perhaps the ones that had been too far gone when they were unearthed had been discarded. My senior picked up one of the boxes and shone his light on it. The moment I saw it, I broke out in a cold sweat. The box was crudely placed, yet every surface was covered in dense writing, black ink covering every inch with sutras. I heard my senior muttering the sutras as he read them. Please stop, I thought. If you keep going, something terrible will happen. In the faint light of the penlight, my senior licked his finger and rubbed away the sutras around the edge of the box. There was no other seal. He slowly lifted the lid. At that moment, my heart grew cold with fear, and I couldn't bring myself to look. A muffled groan came from my senior as he peered into the box, his hand covering his mouth. I found myself running toward the exit. With no light to guide me, I stumbled and fell multiple times. But I couldn't stay there any longer. I scrambled up the stairs and out into the faint moonlight, collapsing near the temple gate. I don't know how long I stayed there. Eventually, my senior appeared beside me, his face pale. "Let's go," he said. The next day, we left the house where we had been staying for a week. No one said, "Come back soon." I knew I wouldn't. I couldn't imagine ever coming back. On the train ride home, I didn't ask my senior about what he had seen in the box. I felt that as long as we were in that land, I couldn't ask. Toward the end of the summer vacation, I started seeing people with deformities in rapid succession. When I mentioned this to my senior, I somehow blurted out, "By the way, about that box," "Oh, that," he responded nonchalantly. I wasn't expecting it at all, but what I found in the box really shook me up. He sat cross-legged, a serious expression on his face. I wasn't prepared to hear what he was about to say, but my senior continued regardless. It was the corpse of an infant, mummified, its body starting to decompose. Given the state of the box, I hadn't expected something like that. Out of the 26 boxes, only 3 contained mummified infants. Infants? I was confused. The explanation was grotesque, not because of what was in the box, but because it didn't fit the narrative. These were supposed to be the essences extracted from the bodies of the dead. It's not like it was a funeral ritual specifically for women who died in childbirth. All funerals in that village were carried out in this way. I don't have a clear answer for this, but I suspect it was connected to the practice of thinning out the population through infanticide and the abandonment of the elderly. Infanticide and abandonment are relics of an era of extreme poverty that no longer exist in modern Japan. Was the idea of extracting the essence from the body just a cover for families secretly handing over unwanted infants? If that were the case, then the villagers must have known. But they couldn't admit it. The whole ritual was built around the pretense of not knowing what was in those boxes. But my senior shook his head. No, you've got it backward. All the boxes contained infants. But it's strange to think that when an elderly person died, there would just happen to be an unwanted baby born. It was the other way around. An unwanted baby was born, and then an elderly person was killed. The way he described it made me sick. It was grotesque in a different way. I can't say for sure why both of these funerals had to be carried out simultaneously, but it seems to me that if they were reducing the number of mouths to feed by getting rid of the elderly, they felt they also had to reduce the number of mouths in the future. Why the ritual included the appearance of extracting something from the body of the dead elder was unclear. It felt like we were staring into the dark depths of an ancient, rural custom. Oh, and about that family of shamans who conducted the rituals, the Kai. I mentioned they were wiped out, but that's not entirely true. After the last head of the family died, one of his daughters married into a family in the village. My senior said this with a strange, inscrutable smile, the kind of smile he wore whenever he encountered the dark side of humanity. That's the family we stayed with. In other words, inside me too, he seemed to say, pointing at his own chest.